like you sympathize with her to the point where when it's the country party and they are going down to the creek, like this dread starts to build. You're like, oh no, Nellie, don't go to the creek. It's not going to go well, Nellie.
Like the first scene in a horror movie where you say to the blonde girl, just don't go.
Don't go.
Welcome to Land of Laura, the irreverent yet scholarly podcast about all things Laura Ingalls Wilder. Last week in episode 16, Wendy McClure told us all about the beginnings of children's publishing in the United States and its relationship with the Little House books. Today she picks up where she left off in 1940, starting with the legendary editor Ursula Nordstrom.
Ida Louise Raymond left Harper in 1940 to raise a child. So good for her.
Da-da!
Da-da! That brings us to Ursula Nordstrom, who is a big deal editor. But first, she was like Ida Louise had been to Virginia Kirkus. Ursula had been Ida Louise Raymond's secretary. So she had been around since Plum Creek, and so she was familiar with the books in that sense. And then over time, she kind of became known as like the big children's book editor of the 20th century, just because of like all the great books that she did. And she would do this over the course of like the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. So, she was working on the Little House books, but she was also doing Where the Wild Things Are and Goodnight Moon and Harold and the Purple Crayon and Where the Sidewalk Ends, Shel Silverstein. She was doing Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little and Harriet the Spy and Freaky Friday and just all these books. And also if you're following, if you want to be up on your queer history, she published the first mainstream YA novel with a gay protagonist called I'll Get There, It Better Be Worth the Trip by John Donovan. She wasn't very public about it, but Ursula was herself gay. But, just a huge influence. And also, I think she sort of introduced that element of children's books being kind of subversive. And I know that you and Pamela Smith-Hill were talking about that. And I think a lot of it does go back to Ursula. One of her famous quotes was, I published good books for bad children. And her letters, by the way, are hilarious. There is a really great collection called Dear Genius that's edited by Leonard Marcus. And those are her letters to various authors, including Laura Ingalls Wilder, and also to various people talking about like when, first 4 years manuscript came in, things like that. So there's lots of fun stuff that you can read about from her point of view.
Yeah, you mentioned this in a previous conversation I had with you, and it is on the way to me right now.
Yes, it's so good. It's so funny. The things she will say to folks like Shel Silverstein, she'll be like, if you can get away from the, poolside at the Playboy Mansion to, work on this manuscript, excuse me. And also she had a really great relationship with Garth Williams as well. And that's really where she comes in as being a really important editor, because she actually did not, and she will admit this herself, do anything to shape the narrative of the books, because we all know why, because Rose was working on them, so she'd get these great manuscripts. But her big role was the 1953 editions of the series. So, that was really important because before then, there were a couple of different illustrators. The books weren't uniform. They didn't have quite a cohesive look. They were different trim sizes, which is a big deal when you're trying to make box sets. They have to be the same size to fit in that little slipcase.
And you know what? I'm going back to Laurapalooza this past summer with this question, but didn't they change the trim size between Plum Creek and Silver Lake? Because it was like the kids' books were square and then, yeah.
Yeah. I wonder what the thinking was with that. I think, I think part of it was like, oh, well, it's a little bit of an older audience. And that's actually an interesting thing to think about as well, too, because I think that uniform edition also made the books, it sort of one thing, and it wasn't necessarily for one single reading audience in terms of age group, but they could be consumed together. And I think in the previous iteration of this series, there was sort of a line between the younger books and the older books. Kind of like Betsy and Tacy. I think they've got the younger books and the older books, right? From here on out, the books were uniform, and she sought out Garth Williams to illustrate. She knew him from Stuart Little. I think that was his first children's book that he illustrated. And there's a fun story about how he illustrated Stuart Little, and also a really fun story about the publication of Stuart Little. So this goes back to, remember Anne Carroll Moore
with the stamp.
This with a stamp, yes, and very opinionated. And she had read a New Yorker article that E.B. White had written about children's books, and she was like, "Oh, Mr. White, you must write a children's book. You are perfect," And he's like, "Well, okay." So he got signed on with Ursula Nordstrom to write a children's book. And so he wrote Stuart Little, which, as you know, is about a child who's also a mouse, and then he goes on adventures. This whole time he was, working on the book with Ursula Nordstrom, and then Garth Williams doing the illustrations. Anne Carroll Moore was like, "Oh, I want to see the book. I want to see the book. I'm so excited to see the book." And so they showed her the book, and she was suddenly like, "Oh, what is this?" She didn't get it. I mean, to be fair, the book is kind of bonkers, but
it is.
But she was like, "Oh, this is going to confuse children," and she freaked out, and she was like, "You can't publish this book." She was trying to talk him out of publishing it and trying to talk Ursula Nordstrom out of publishing it. They're like, "No, actually, we think it's pretty good." But she's like, "No," and she really flipped. The book came out and it was fine, but that's Anne Carroll Moore for you. And also, like we said, Stuart Little it's a little bit of a weird book, and Garth Williams made it work. And I think that was part of why Ursula thought he was such a great choice, because Stuart Little is sort of this conjured up world and premise, but he was really doing the work in the illustrations to make that world seem really, grounded and real, and lots of like little thoughtful details. So like Stuart Little's, he's a mouse, and then you understand what his world is like because he uses little objects like clothespins for bedposts. So you understand like what his size is. So just that kind of sense of being able to create a world. Ursula Nordstrom approached him to illustrate the Little House books. I think it was a great choice. So, he'd work on illustrating the books. I think 7 years he was working on them. He went out and visited Rose, and then visited, did he also visit? I think he also visited Laura Del Manzo. I can't remember.
Yeah, I think I read in Prairie Fires that he visited Rose sort of to suss out whether it would be a good idea to go visit her parents. And she's like, writing his itinerary and, just basically was like, "Go forth."
Yeah, that's right. And he went forth, and he went around to almost all the home sites. This was back when they didn't really know where the Little House on the Prairie site was.
Yeah.
So he kind of went somewhere. and kind of sketched the landscape there, which fortunately wasn't that much different from where the home site actually was.
Mm-hmm.
But
in Kansas.
Yeah. I think especially in South Dakota, you can really tell that he had been there just looking at the landscapes. I could go on and on about like how great the illustrations and Helen Gentry's design is, but
Well, tell me about the design. Tell me.
Okay, yeah.
I want to know.
Okay, all right, okay. She did some things that are kind of commonly done today, but not back then, which was to really use the space of the book to make it more immersive. Especially in Little House on the Prairie, you'll open up the book and there'll be a 2-page spread, and the art, just that horizon line goes across, both pages. And so there's that sense of you're already in this world because the pictures and the text are kind of working together. It's not like you just turn the page and there's a little window that where you peer in. You really sort of feel like it's all around you just because of some of those tricks that she did with the design and the way she flowed the pages. It wasn't that she just took the illustrations and then plunked them in a certain way. She had really planned this out and then worked with Garth Williams to really art direct, and they really sort of thought about like how each page spread was going to look, which was a really amazing thing, and it shows. Yeah, working on illustrating and I guess designing the illustrations in the Little House series took 7 years. but clearly it paid off. I don't think we can overestimate the impact of the uniform 1953 edition of the books, because I think it really reset the clock on the lifetime of the books. I think Ursula really did that by producing these editions. By giving them new illustrations and reissuing them, it introduced the books to like a whole new generation of readers. And then, 20 years later with the paperbacks, 20 years is not unusual for a paperback edition for books that sell really well. They want to keep it on hardcover as long as they can. But then when it came out in paperback, it introduced it to yet another new generation of readers, including Ed Friendly's kid, who was in her room, reading this book. And, Ed Friendly was like, hey, what's this?
What year did the paperbacks come out?
1971.
Right. Okay.
I mean, it's possible that she had a hardcover, but I would have to think that, like, going from the timeline, the paperbacks came out in 1971 with the first 4 years. Also sort of stuck in. So I think they made that into an event. So I think there was probably like a lot of promotion, and then a new generation, including, this girl, bought the books. So, and then that, of course, that led to the TV show. So
in 1974.
Yep. So all those things really to sort of contributed to really lengthening the lifetime of the book series. Another thing that came about in the 1953 edition was addressing one of the racism conversations. Ursula had received a letter from a reader pointing out the line, "There were no people, only Indians lived there." When they were
in Little House on the Prairie.
In Little House on the Prairie, yeah. And this person said, like, that line sounds funny. That's implying that Indians are not people. And Ursula was like, oh, yeah, you've got a point. And she pointed it out to Laura as well. And so they wrote this person back and said, yes, we're addressing this. Thank you for pointing this out. And so they changed that from no people to no settlers, which makes it much clearer.
And Laura was totally down with that. She was
yeah.
She called it a blunder on
a
her
blunder,
part.
Yes, yeah. So, and that's something that is definitely an editor's job as well. You'll have like an uncomfortable conversation sometimes it's from someone outside, sometimes it's from someone internally that says like, hey, I'm not sure if your author means this thing that they're saying here. How is that coming off? And so it's really part of an editor's job to sort of sit down and have that conversation with the author and say like, hey, some people are noticing, this line is, it sounds a little questionable. Do you want to maybe do something else? But at the same time, like opening up the conversation, not necessarily like giving the order, like you must change this, but like, hey, let's talk about this. And that's pretty much what Ursula did. Another great outcome of the 1953 series was that suddenly all these librarians were seeing the series, and it kind of sparked this conversation about like, hey, have we been overlooking Laura Ingalls Wilder, with the Newbery Medal? Because, for years she had been getting Newbery Honors, which is like the runner-up award, but she hadn't been getting the medal. And the feeling for a while was that it had possibly been because they were series books, and there was that prejudice against series books going back to the Hardy Boys and the formulaic and cheap, dime novels that were not quality things. We're not approved. But people could obviously, we're starting to say, well, clearly these aren't the same books. This is something really great. This is actually a really great achievement, just looking back and seeing the whole series as a whole work. So that really started the conversation about maybe there needed to be another kind of award that would recognize people like Laura Ingalls Wilder, who had been doing great things, but needed some further recognition, kind of like a Lifetime Achievement Medal. And so that's where the Laura Ingalls Wilder Medal came about. It was decided in 1954, and then it was given to Laura in 1955. And Ursula was really happy because she's like, oh, I spent all this money producing these books, and that, boy, it really justified it. It was a great feather in her cap. She became the first woman to be on the Harper Board of Directors, although she still wasn't quite getting the respect because she was a woman. She's a story at one of the first board meetings that she went to. Someone asked her to make coffee, and she was like, yeah. And she was like, I'm sorry, I don't know how.
Good for her.
Because she rules. So she also oversaw the publication of the first 4 years. So if you read Dear Genius, you can see that letter where she talks about the faint air of disillusion in the first 4 years, but also the excitement of like, oh, there's another book out there. But also that you can see in, I think, multiple letters, she's like, what do we do with this? Do we edit it? Do we not? What do we do? But it's fascinating. And yeah, and that was Ursula.
So putting out the first 4 years, that was kind of the last thing that she did in her career as far as the Little House books were concerned?
Yeah. Yeah, that was just a couple of years before she retired, which was in 1973, although I think she was still doing a few projects here and there, I think up until around 1980.
So let's talk about children's publishing in general going forward.
So yeah, actually, getting us to around the 1980s, I could not find a lot of stuff that was actually happening with the Little House books in the 80s, but a lot of things were happening that kind of set the tone for decisions that would be made in the decade after that. One big thing that happened is that this was kind of the rise of booksellers, both chain booksellers, like, Barnes & Noble got its start back then, but also like B. Dalton and Walden Books. So, you could go to a mall and get a book. But also like independent bookstores were starting to have a moment too. There were a lot more of them. A lot of things came about as a result of there being more retail space for things. One was, board books, which are, great books that could be given as a gift. And then also...
Oh, wow. I just realized I don't remember board books from my childhood.
Right, yeah. And we had little golden books, which were not quite the same thing, but then, board books were really kind of an 80s thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing was series titles. So like Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley High. And what was great about these is that kids could buy these with their own money. So having them in a bookstore, usually having a whole shelf, sort of dedicated to them. And so they could just go and pick up the next one. So that was happening in the 80s. And that really kind of continued into the 90s. And also because everything was becoming more retail driven, people were starting to think about authors and book series as brands. Like Dr. Seuss became a brand. Certain big name authors became a brand. And then sometimes there was merch,
I mean, you're not talking about Sweet Valley High, because those are all different.
Yeah,
And not Sweet Valley High, Sweet Dreams is what I meant.
Oh yeah, all those teen romance series, those had brands.
Fun fact, Susan Wittig Albert, who wrote A Wilder Rose, I don't know if you read A Wilder Rose.
Oh yeah.
Was a ghostwriter for several Sweet Dreams books.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Including the one with Courtney Cox on the cover. The last word about the romance between two debate partners. And no, I didn't read it 100 times.
Oh my God. Well, also I was thinking about Judy Blume was really big too. And then there's that weird sort of interesting crossover with Dean Butler being in the movie version of Forever by Judy Blume.
Oh, right. That was in the 70s. But God.
That was the 70s. You're right. Okay. But fun time though.
Fun time. That was kind of our reading heyday.
Yeah.
So what happened in the 90s?
Oh, in the 90s. A lot happens in the 90s. So that is the time of brand expansion. Little House was the brand. And so lots of things, lots of new books. One of the biggest ones was The Girls of Little House. And I'm not sure if that's officially what it was called, but you had the Rose years and the Caroline years and the Martha years, all those books from the point of view of Laura's ancestors and descendant and exploring different historical periods. And, if this sounds a little bit like American Girl, that was probably by design. At the same time, you had the Dear America series from Scholastic, these sort of kid's eye view of, historical periods. Nat Geo had a Once Upon America series. This was all over the place. I also just found out that Scholastic is bringing the Dear America books back starting next year in the spring. They're reissuing the first two. I think it's a Mayflower one and the Revolutionary War one with fancy new covers.
Wow.
So get ready. The Rose books, I think, kind of started with Roger Lee McBride. It might have been his idea initially, and that could have been because he had Rose's books and he had the rights to all those things. And so I think they were exploring some of that material because they had it.
And wasn't he listed as the author, at least for the Rose books? Yeah.
Yeah, he was listed as the author, but I know that the first Rose book had a ghostwriter, and then some other books like Bachelor Girl borrowed from Rose's novels. Diverging Roads, a big chunk of that is in Bachelor Girl, which I remember reading that and being like, wait, this rings a bell. So, I'm not sure if that was, just a happy coincidence that it then kind of fit in with other stuff that was happening or what. But anyway, that was there. That was one thing that they were doing. But they were also just expanding the core series into all these different age categories and formats. So that's where we get the board books and the picture books illustrated by Renee Grafe, and also chapter books. This was definitely about brand and trying to expand the audience, but also there were some advantages to doing it this way because, you could take advantage of like different sales opportunities. So you could put the little house books, that material into different formats. You could take advantage of these seasonal moments that are really great in retail and libraries, like fall and Christmas and back to school. And so I think if you look at those chapter books, I think there are titles that really kind of align with those moments. I'm not sure, but it's possible those chapter books maybe aligned better where the history curricula was in some elementary school programs. They had lots of ideas, and expanding the range of those books was the strategy. There's definitely risk with that strategy because when you do something like that, there's the risk you cannibalize your own audience, especially when you're reaching out to these younger age groups, because that means the kids encounter stories at a younger age in kind of like this abridged form. And so then by the time they're old enough to read the original books, they know them already. So there may not be that discovery. But a lot of brands were doing this. And it's a pretty common thing to expand into different age categories. Sometimes they age up, sometimes they age down. Like Fancy Nancy, that was a picture book. But then there were chapter books. And, so.
Sweet Valley Twins.
Sweet Valley Twins, yes, yeah. I think the American Girl books and Dear America, those were different age groups. So they might have just been covering their bases, Yet another strategy they had was to expand some of the publishing for adults, for adult Little House fans. So that's where we get the Little House Guidebook, which I remember buying for my, all my travels. Barbara Walker's cookbook was already out there, but they had...
I think 1979 maybe. It was like the first one. Yeah.
Yeah, that was probably maybe the first... one of the first things that they had that wasn't part of the books. And that is still going strong.
Yeah. With good reason.
I know. Yeah. So the 90s was a really big time for Harper and the Little House brand.
The Little House brand.
Yeah. And so that continued into the 2000s. I think then there was maybe a little bit more of a sense of just still trying different things. They were adding more stories, but not in, like adding a whole other series. It was more, they had the Cynthia Ryland, Burr Oak book, Old Town and the Green Rose. And, I think that definitely reflected a trend too, which was to sort of like have prequels or fill in things, It's not exactly a prequel, but it's filling in a gap. Also, there was a Nellie Olson book, which I personally love. I think it's
What's it called? I don't know if The Mary book is Mary Ingalls on Her Own, right?
Mary Ingalls on Her Own, yeah. I think it's Nellie Olson and Laura Ingalls. I think that's what it's called, and it's all from Nellie's point of view.
Do we sympathize with her?
Yeah, I think the author did a really good job. I think it was Tui Sutherland. What I loved about it is that it worked entirely within the parameters of On the Banks of Plum Creek. So there's never any scenes with Laura that you don't see in On the Banks of Plum Creek. I don't think she ever says anything that she doesn't say in On the Banks of Plum Creek. So it was sort of really tight that way.
But you really like it.
And like you sympathize with her to the point where, it's when it's the country party and they are going down to the creek. Like this dread starts to build. You're like, oh no, Nellie, don't go to the creek. It's not going to go well, Nellie.
Like the first scene in a horror movie where you say to the blonde girl, just don't go.
Don't go. Yeah. It's building, but they take liberties but it's all really thoughtful. I mean, you have to take liberties. You're putting in pieces that don't already exist. So anyway, yeah, big love for the Nellie Olson book.
Post-edit edition. The book is called Nellie Olson Meets Laura Ingalls, and it is indeed by Tui Sutherland.
And then became the Little House Big Adventure reboot with the photographic covers. Remember those?
I try to forget.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm sorry. Yes, yeah. I think I do. I thought it was the 90s, but no. It was the early 2000s.
It was the early 2000s, yeah. So, yeah, because they had the Rose years and the Caroline years. A lot of those had those. They had their Dan. I think it's Dan Andreessen did those covers. I'm trying to remember.
That sounds right.
Yeah, they had those, and then they scaled back on some of those, and then I think they abridged some. And then I think a few of those books, like especially the Rose books, also got that photographic cover treatment. So yeah, that was interesting. That was, probably, I think, the last big effort in promoting Little House as kids' books. And I think, the strategy was they wanted to really emphasize the adventure aspect and really sort of speak to where kids were. But I think a big part of it too, and I don't know this for sure, but I suspect one reason for doing these editions was to have the books in paperback at a lower and more competitive price point. And the way to do that,
they didn't have the Garth Williams illustrations.
Right. So that was how they would do it. That was how you would make the price point lower, because you weren't having to pay royalties for the artwork. I think compared to lots of other books out there, I think the Little House books, their budget probably includes a pretty big allotment for the royalties for lots of reasons. Over the years, Garth Williams, negotiated better rates because he wasn't paid so well, to begin with, in those first years. And then as the books got bigger and bigger, sometimes you can go back and say like, hey, these books are still doing really well. I'd like another percentage point on my royalty, please. That's something that happens. But at the same time, there are lots of other books out there that are selling for a couple dollars less. And so I have a feeling that's what happened. And it's a little hard to check because, publishers make list price adjustments over the years. But I think the list price of those books is at least $1 or $2 less than the Garth Williams illustrated editions. And I think they were $5.99 or $6.99. And I think that was kind of similar to what the American Girl books were going for. So
interesting.
Yeah, that's just a theory, but I think that's because the Garth Williams illustrations are really kind of iconic. So I think you had to have a really compelling reason to do the books without them, and I think part of it was the price point, and then also taking the opportunity to maybe sort of repackage and to see if there's a different hook. Big adventure. So. So, that kind of takes us kind of around to the present. So, since then, they've brought back the Garth Williams books. They've done them in color now. So that's a little bit of added value. And I think now they're really kind of positioning most of the Little House related books for the adult audience. You've got the selected letters. That's Harper. It's a different imprint, but probably still related. They did the Little House cookbook, Barbara Walker's cookbook, in a hardcover gifty edition. The paperback is still out there because that's still going strong. And then they did those hardcover editions of Big Woods and Little House on the Prairie. Do you remember those? With they had forwards by Laura Bush for one of them and Ree Drummond.
Ree Drummond?
Yeah, I think so. I think she did. Can't remember which one she did the forward to.
Wow, did not know that. I mean, Laura Bush makes sense because she's
librarian.
Well known as but I didn't know that about Pioneer Woman. Interesting.
Yeah, and the ones with the wood veneer covers and the silhouettes, those, and
wow, I don't know. Perhaps I don't look at the Little House section in bookstores anymore. Okay, but maybe I should.
Yeah, I know them because. Well, I noticed them when they came out, and then also an old coworker of mine was involved in the design on them, and so she was telling me about some of the choices they made, which was like the wood veneer on those covers. For each one, it's a little bit different. They were using wood from trees native to, Wisconsin and Kansas. So
That is awesome.
Those are okay. Book designers are the most amazing people in the world because they think of stuff like this.
And let's shout out to, what was her name?
Helen Gentry.
Helen Gentry, the designer of the 1953 editions.
Game changer. Yeah.
Designers rule. Okay.
Yeah. That's sort of my overview of the Little House Publishing to date.
Oh, this was so fun to learn. So it seems the Little House books have been kind of falling out of favor, and people are sort of hand-wringing on the internet about, kids aren't reading the books these days. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. Well, one is that kids' books, they come and go. Most children's books do not have the kind of long life that the Little House books have had. If kids aren't coming to them in the way that they used to, I'm not surprised, but also not bothered by it, just because I think there's still enough adults reading the books and passing them on to kids that I think they'll still be around for a while. It can be a natural development with classic children's books that more adults will read them than kids. I think we've seen this happen with like Anne of Green Gables and Betsy Tacy.
And those books didn't necessarily get, I mean, I don't actually know a lot about Anne of Green Gables, but those books didn't get the treatments that the Little House books did. I mean, there was the new editions in 1953, which reset the clock on their popularity, and then 20 years later was the TV show. So they've gotten these boosts.
Yeah. I think it's pretty likely that the Netflix series will probably bring a lot of young readers back to the books. And I think that's a great thing. No matter how people feel about, the adaptation, the books will still be out there for people to go to and for kids to discover. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens with that. And then also interesting things can happen with things like TikTok. Backlist is a thing, books that have been published in the past, like coming back and having a resurgence because somebody was on TikTok. One of our biggest bestsellers, the place where I work right now, was a book that came out like over 10 years ago and became a New York Times bestseller more than a decade after it first came out because
someone did a TikTok on it?
Yeah, some people were finding it on TikTok and crying about it because it's a very, very sad YA. And then a colleague of mine works on those books. And then they did a very, very sad sequel to the very, very sad YA. And that's also a New York Times bestseller. So things can happen. And also, I think, the Little House books are still very much in the public conversation. The books are part of that, but it's also sort of part of something bigger as well. I think it'll be especially interesting to see what happens in the next few years when we get into public domain with these first books. Little House in the Big Woods enters public domain actually 2 years from this Thursday. So it's 761 days as of today of copyright protection left.
Maybe we'll start a clock.
I know, yeah.
A countdown clock. We'll start a countdown clock.
So that'll be interesting. The Garth Williams illustrations are still going to be under copyright for another 20 years because that goes back to 1953. Mm-hmm. January 1st is now, a lot of people call it Public Domain Day. And so I would suggest anyone who is curious about this or worried about it to Google Public Domain Day 2025, 2024, to see like what has gone into public domain that they recognize in terms of, different works, and to sort of see what has happened. Because I think a lot of times people will do things with public domain just because they can and because it's kind of interesting, but you may not notice just because it's happening in another area that you're maybe like not the audience for that. There is a very good chance, I will warn people right now, that we might see a Big Woods horror movie. It seems to have been the response in the past few years to things like Winnie the Pooh and Steamboat Willie the first Mickey Mouse cartoon going into public domain, is that there's, there's now Screamboat Willie. So,
awesome.
and
I
I
look
know.
forward to that.
I mean,
Gives a whole new meaning to Mad Dog.
Yes, I know. Honestly, I think with like the right director, you could do a really great like Big Woods horror, Ma and the bear, and like, what if that bear is like a shapeshifter? I don't know.
It'll be fun to find out.
Yeah. The Little Engine That Could is going to be going into public domain, so maybe keep an eye on that. I do think we're probably going to see, some people are probably going to try to make crappy AI illustrated editions of Little House in the Big Woods, but I don't know whether people are going to buy them.
Thumbs down.
Yeah. So it's weird, but I think it's also fascinating. And I think it'll be really interesting for the whole sort of conversation about Little House, because I think a lot of people think about legacy as kind of like a fortress, like it's something to be defended. And I tend to think it's more of a conversation. And so you're going to have interesting people joining the conversation. And then, and I think that's going to happen as well with the Netflix series too. So yeah, just buckle up. That's all I can say.
Buckle up.
Hey, and then also any horror screenwriters out there,
send it to Wendy.
Want to poke my brain, you like some of these ideas, pay me. But
she is available, and she is very talented.
Yeah.
Thank you, Wendy, for being on the podcast today. I have had so much fun.
This has been so great. Thank you so much. I was so glad to come back.
Isn't Wendy McClure the best? I love talking to her about Little House. After we talked, I did a little more digging and was tickled to discover that A Wilder Rose author, Susan Wittig Albert, has written, either ghostwritten or under a pseudonym, many more series books than I realized, including Nancy Drew and Sweet Valley Twins books, plus Hardy Boys books, along with her husband. You can expect to hear more from Wendy in upcoming episodes. Land of Laura is created and executive produced by me, Sandra Hume. Special thanks to Canadian folk punk band The Dreadnaughts for our theme music, and extra special thanks to all the guests, like Wendy, who give so generously of their time and knowledge. Make sure you subscribe to Land of Laura on your favorite podcast channel so you can hear about episodes as soon as they drop. As Pa says, there's plenty more down cellar in a teacup, and as Ma might have said, it takes all kinds of people to make a Little House world.